Okay, the recording has begun. So we're at the very last line of 3B3, and we're going to be moving on to page 4, to folio 4A, in a second. And I know that I sent it out to a bunch of people, and I hope that you have it. It's also available, of course, on Sefaria, as we've said in the past. So the text is going to move from Megillah 3 to Megillah 4. What we've had is a string of teachings from Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. And what he has been teaching mostly is stuff that has to do with the surrounding rules around when the Megillah shall be read, in what town constitutes a small town, an open town, what constitutes a big city, what constitutes a walled city. And remember that he had a discussion on 3B3 on the column that we're concluding, where we figured out that there are two kinds of criteria for what makes a walled city or a big city. And one is the walls themselves, and one is whether or not the city has a communal infrastructure of enough people, 10 is the minimum, who are available for the spiritual needs of the community. And what we have in Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi's teaching is that there's a little bit of a difference between the two of them. When it comes to a walled city, we need a city to have been walled in from the time of Joshua. Well, that's a long time ago. So the question is, what happens if the walls come tumbling down? What happens if there are no walls anymore? It was a walled city at the time of Joshua, but now it's not. So the final decision of the Talmud is that it doesn't matter if there's no wall anymore. As long as there was a wall at the time of Joshua, then fine. So that's number one. And if, let's say, if the walls come tumbling down and the walls get rebuilt 100 years later, or even 1,000 years later, we would say, oh, but these are new walls. No, as long as it was a walled city from the time of Joshua, that's good enough. So that criterion, once it's met, then that's it. But the criterion of the spiritual infrastructure, the idea that you need a minimum number of people who are devoted to the to ministering to the spiritual needs, the religious needs of the community, that minyan that we were talking about in various ways, that actually has to be constantly present. If it's not present, then the city loses its status. But it can be reconstituted if another time comes by and all of a sudden now we do have the minyan, then great. Then the standard has been met again, and it's reinstated as a big city. So that's where we left off. Now we're at the last line on 3B3 going into 4A. So another teaching from Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. Do we have somebody who would like to read for us?
I'll read, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Where are we, though?
The last two lines on 3B3, right-hand column. Another teaching.
Another teaching from Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi. And Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi also said, now where do I go?
Next page. Now you're at the packet of Megillah 4. You have to get Megillah 4.
Yeah, just give me a minute. I want to come up. Let's see.
You got it?
I'm getting it. It's taking a while. I'm sorry.
Would it be okay if somebody else read?
Wait, I got it now.
Okay, great. Go ahead.
All right. The cities of Lod, that's where I am.
Mm-hmm.
The cities of Lod, Ono, and Geharashim were surrounded by walls in the days of Joshua, son of Nun, and therefore read the Megillah on the 15th of Adar.
Okay, so this is now, instead of a theoretical point that he's making, a conceptual idea of how do we define this city, or how do we, what are the criteria that we set up? Now he's just giving us some facts. Here's 3 cities that satisfy these criteria. What are the 3 cities? The 3 cities, or at least the first criterion, the historical criterion of cities that were walled-in cities at the time of Joshua. So he gives us these 3 cities. So Lud, Ono, and Geharashim. Okay, so Lud is where outside of which we have the airport, the Ben Gurion airport. Used to also be called Lud or Lida. Ono is, I don't know where it is. Apparently the note says it's in the middle of the country, somewhere not too far away from Lud, and in between, let's say, Lud and Jerusalem, and Gei HaCharashim, the valley of the plowers, some kind of valley place where there was a settlement. So these ancient cities, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says, they qualify. In my book, they count as cities that were walled in by Joshua. Now the Gemara.
The Gemara questions this. And did Joshua build these cities? Were these cities in existence in the days of Joshua? But El Pa'al built them. As it is written, and the sons of El Pa'al were Ever, Misham, and Shamed. He built Ono and Lod and its dispensations.
And its dependencies.
I'm sorry. And its dependencies.
Okay. So they, if you look at note 3, look at note 3. This verse comes from the book of Chronicles.
Since these cities were by El Pa'al, they could not have been in existence in the days of Yehoshua, who led the initial conquest of Eretz Yisrael. Apparently, the Gemara's question concerns only the cities of Ono and Lod. Gai Harashim is not mentioned in this verse as a city built by El Pa'al.
Okay, so we have 2 of the 3 cities that Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi has mentioned are mentioned in Scripture, in Chronicles, as having been built later by a man named El Pa'al. He and his sons built these cities. So how do we understand that Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi could say that these were built by Joshua? Okay, so they're asking about those 2 particular cities. Okay, go ahead. And now back into the text, the Gemara's question.
The Gemara's question is based on the premise that wherever in Scripture it says that someone built a city, it implies that the city was not in existence beforehand. That premise is now challenged.
Okay, remember in the last page we had that it's possible for cities to have walls and then they crumble and then they get rebuilt. So why do we have to assume that El Pa'al built the city from afresh? And yet that's the assumption of the question. He's giving credit. He's given credit for building these cities. So apparently, the cities didn't exist beforehand. They didn't exist in the time of Joshua. But now the Gemara will say, "Wait a second. Who says cities have complicated histories?" Go ahead.
But according to your premise, these cities could not have been in existence in the time of El Pa'al either, because Asa, who lived after El Pa'al, built them, as it is written, and Asa built fortified cities which are to Judah.
Okay, so Asa was one of the kings of Judah, and according to the verse, he built the cities. So, and the verse is a little general. It doesn't name the cities, but it says that that he built walled cities in Judah. So apparently this includes these walled cities of Ono and so on. So how do we understand the history here? Who gets credit for building the cities? You're saying that El Pa'al should get credit? No, but we have another verse that says Asa should get credit. So none of these verses should challenge Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, because each of them is simply saying that each of these people maybe rebuilt the city, but Joshua can still be given credit for having built it first. Okay, I want to highlight one kind of a little problematic assumption that is being made one way or the other. And that is that when we say that walled cities from the time of Joshua, do we mean that Joshua built the walled city? That's not the simple understanding. The simple understanding is when Joshua comes in to the country, to the land of Israel to conquer it, there are cities that were already there, that were walled, right? That would be our working assumption. But now what we're finding out is no, what we're talking about here is not the fact that there's an antiquity involved. What we're talking about is something else. We're talking about the building up, the settlement of the land by the Jewish people. So in that sense, the fact that Jericho had walls when Joshua came in to conquer it, that's of no interest to us whatsoever. In fact, Joshua had to knock them down in order to conquer the city. The point is, what are the cities that were built up by the Jewish people when they came in to take possession of the land? What are the walled cities that were established by the first generation of Israel as they entered the land of Israel to take it over? This goes back to our earlier discussion. Why are we adopting this standard anyway? Why don't we just take the standard of Shushan? Shushan is where the miracle happened. Shushan is where the Purim story happened. So what are we all of a sudden, putting Joshua into the picture? The answer is, we talked about it back then, that this is an effort on the part of the rabbis to take an exile-based story, right? Something that happens in Persia, and root it in the land of Israel, to bring it back into the land of Israel itself. So what they therefore said was, it's great, the miracle happened in Shushan, that's beautiful, terrific, thank God. We're happy that we survived, but let's not remember that let's not forget that, let us remember that our beginnings are from earlier. Our beginnings are from when we entered into the land of Israel and built those cities. So it has to be, according to their view, some kind of key effort on the part of the Jewish people to build their own society, to build their own nation. So that's the assumption that's underneath this. And now the point is that things can be rejuvenated, renovated, rebuilt, but it has to start from the time of Joshua. Okay. There's an interesting note that the text of the verse that we have in our Gemara is a text that doesn't exist. The verse is not found anywhere in that precise way. So you have that in note 4. You can read that for a second, please. You got it?
This verse is not
I'm going to ask somebody whose phone is not muted to mute your phone. The phone with 00 at the end, please mute your phone. *6, mute your phone.
This verse is not found anywhere in Scripture. Masoris Hashas amends the Gemara's text to read, built fortified cities.
And he built fortified cities in Judah. Okay, so he finds a verse that has the same point. Okay, so that's just, we should understand that every once in a while, when the Talmud quotes a verse, it paraphrases the verse. It's saying a verse that sort of is out there, but it's not checking it deliberately, which is an interesting little phenomenon. On the one hand, the Talmud is a stickler for reading every single word in a verse very carefully and squeezing every single specific meaning and significance out of why this word is used, why not that word is used. But then sometimes it's just throwing out there references to verses, and then it says it in a kind of a quick and rough form. So that's an example we have here. We have other places in Talmud where this happens, and it becomes a scholarly discussion. Can this be evidence that there was more than one version of this verse, or is it really just simply that the Talmud every once in a while is quoting by heart and is going fast and doesn't quite quote the verse accurately? So who knows? Okay.
Now where?
Go ahead.
Where do you want me? Above or number?
Let's go back to the Gemara. Rather, the correct version.
Okay. Rather, the correct version of events is as follows. Rabbi Elazar said, these cities were surrounded by walls in the days of Yehoshua, son of Nun. They were destroyed during the concubine in Gibeah, and El Pa'al came and rebuilt them. They again fell, and Asa came and restored them. The Gemara proves this assertion that Asa merely restored cities that were already in existence.
Keep going.
Okay.
Here's the proof.
A precise reading of the following verse also bears this out. For it is written, and he, Asa, said to Judah, let us build these cities. By calling them cities, he implies that they were regarded as cities from before. Learn from this that the cities built by Asa were already in existence, and Asa merely restored them. Okay.
So here we have then the final conclusion, which is not surprising, fits in well with what our images of how things actually happen. And that is that the cities have an up and down roller coaster kind of history, and they have times of glory and times when they're really built up, and then things go badly for a city and it sort of gets knocked down or conquered, or it deteriorates, the trade routes move or something like that, and then they can come back to life again. So that's what happened here with these cities. Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi is saying is, even though you may remember that these cities have had times of bad times or times of ruin, nevertheless, we should always remind ourselves that these cities qualify for reading the Megillah on the 15th day of Adar, because originally back in the glory days of Joshua, they had walls, and that's what we're remembering, and that's what we're celebrating. We're celebrating that new beginning that Joshua exemplifies. So that's the history in a nutshell. There's a reference here, just quickly, we're not going to spend a lot of time on it, to the concubine of Giva, the Pilegesh Begiva. Pilegesh Begiva is this horrible story that is related at the very end of the book of Judges. And it tells us that there was this horrific example of a gang rape and a murder of a woman who was somebody's pilegesh, somebody's concubine. And it was in the region, the city of Giv'ah, which means hilltop, but it was the name of a city, and it was actually the birthplace of Saul, and it was in the tribe of Benjamin. So there was this terrible scandal, and as a result of that crime, all of the other tribes of Israel went to war against Benjamin because Benjamin refused to bring the culprits to justice. And there was a terrible civil war, and eventually things quieted down when we learned Ta'anit. Remember that tractate that we learned about a while back that we made a siyum on? So in that tractate, it talks about the 15th day of Av as a day of joy and celebration. The happiest day in the Jewish calendar, alongside of Yom Kippur, is the 15th day of Av, Tu B'Av. And one of the reasons is given is that that's the day when there was the reconciliation between the tribe of Benjamin and all of the tribes that went to war against them because of this story. What happened was that they were sort of put into cherem. They were sort of excommunicated, the tribe of Benjamin, and nobody was allowed to marry anybody in the tribe of Benjamin because of this terrible attack that they were guilty of condoning against this woman. So it's one of these really fascinating sort of anti and proto-feminist stories in the Torah all at the same time. On the 15th of Av, finally, the tribes found a way to get back together again. So what we have here is one side point, that the cities in this area were destroyed during the Civil War. They were destroyed by the conquering armies of the other tribes of Israel, and then they had to be rebuilt afterwards. Okay, so now we've got we've settled the point about the history of cities for now, and we've identified a number of cities who are required to read the Megillah on the 15th and not on the 14th. Okay, now we're up to another teaching.
Another teaching from Reb Yehoshua ben Levi. And Reb Yehoshua ben Levi
also said,
no, I just messed up something. Also said, women are obligated in the reading of the Megillah, for they too were involved in that miracle.
Okay, so that's a short teaching, and the Talmud, after spending a whole column of Schottenstein discussion about this city and that wall and the history, when it comes to this teaching, the Talmud is not interested in following up on it at all, but we will. So here is an important subject. It's a huge subject, and here we just have one little piece of it, right? He has to teach us this teaching, because otherwise we wouldn't know it. He says women are obligated in the reading of the Megillah. So why wouldn't we know that? Why isn't it obvious? Does he have to tell us that women have to keep Shabbos? Right? Does he have to does he have to tell us that women have to eat kosher?
Women are normally obligated with respect to the negative commandments, but their obligation for positive commandments it's not non-existent, but it's much less certain.
Right.
This is a time bound. This is a time bound
Exactly.
mitzvah, and there's this whole thing about women not being obligated. The reason that we're not going to treat you as equal is because you guys haven't got the time. You have to be home with the kids. So yeah.
Right. That's one way of understanding what the time bound thing is about. And that's a very well accepted explanation. So let's start, in baby steps here. From the point of view of the rabbis, and I don't think they invented this. I think that they inherited this, living in the kind of culture that they lived in. We don't know, except for of the mythical what is it, Atlantis, or what's the
Amazon.
Amazon, that's it. I knew it began with an A. So except for the mythical Amazon women that run their own country, it's very rare in human culture to have the picture of the women be in charge. Now that doesn't mean that often women weren't in charge. Sometimes they were in charge, but they were never. It was very rare for the way people talked about life to acknowledge that women are in charge. The overwhelming record throughout human history all over the world is that men are given the credit of being in charge, and the women are the helpers, and the women are the second class citizens. I've said this before, but it bears repeating because it's truly amazing. We live in a time where many of us, and we shouldn't assume that it's everybody, and even we live in the first time in all of human history where the concept of egalitarianism is accepted as not challengeable, right? We are literally the first time in thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years, we are for the first time living in a time when the concept is that a woman or a man are just fully both human and capable of anything and everything that human beings can do, need to do, should do for themselves and for each other. We haven't completely outgrown the thousands and thousands of years of our culture that tell us that's not the way it is, but we have made this amazing breakthrough, and we should acknowledge that it's amazing. It's only 100 years since women have been given the right to vote. I mean, it's mind-boggling. So the whole question of whether women are included in something or not, it was always taken for granted that they were not included unless otherwise proven to be included, right? Guilty until proven innocent, so to speak. So, of course, this creates all kinds of problems with human living, because what do we, what are we going to do without those women, as Freud would say, right? From the male perspective, we certainly can't get along without them. So there's always this kind of like false consciousness going on, where the men keep on, taking charge of everything, but they are constantly dependent on women, literally, of course, for their own life, right? None of us would be alive if not for a woman. So, so the place of women in society and in culture and in history and in all of the things that make a group's life go on is always fraught. It's always problematic. Here we have Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi saying, with regard to this particular mitzvah or this particular practice, women are in. So why is that necessary? Because in general, women are, as Stuart pointed out, women are bound by all of the restrictions that every other Jew is bound by. All of the prohibitions of the Torah apply equally to everybody in the Jewish people. It's the positive commandments, the positive obligations that become questioned one by one. So the rough and ready standard that was developed by the rabbis, and it's a standard that's very imperfect, is that women are exempt from positive time-bound obligations. If there's an obligation that depends on kicking in at a particular time, then in general, the general rule is that women are not obligated. So, for instance, tzedakah. We're all commanded a positive mitzvah to give tzedakah. Is there any particular time we're supposed to give tzedakah? No. So women and men are equally obligated to give tzedakah. We're commanded, love your neighbor as yourself. Does it tell us any place when you should love your neighbor as yourself? No. So therefore, you're always, everyone is obligated. You're obligated to be holy. It doesn't tell us you should be holy from 9 o'clock till 10 o'clock, but after that, no. So therefore, everybody is obligated to be holy in various ways. We're obligated to honor our parents. So what's the deal with that? Is there a time limit for that? Is there a specific time of that? No. So everybody's obligated. But then it gets tricky. What about Shabbat? I mean, Shabbat is certainly a time-bound mitzvah. It's exactly, that's the time is in the essence of what Shabbat is. Shabbat doesn't exist on Tuesday. It only exists from this moment, Friday night, to that moment, Saturday night. And that's it. That's what Shabbat is. It's essentially about time. So what about that? So not to do anything to violate Shabbat is, of course, something that's a negative commandment. Negative commandments apply universally. But what about the positive commandments of Shabbat? What about the Shabbat commandment to sanctify Shabbat, to make Kiddush, to light Friday night candles, to have 3 meals, to positively rest and use it as a pleasurable day rather than a day of anxiety and stress? These are all positive commandments. So women should be exempt, right?
But they're in the home.
If it's a time-bound mitzvah, they should be exempt.
But they're in the home, isn't it? So isn't the time-boundness when they're required to be somewhere else, and that takes them out of the home? No.
Let's take sitting in a sukkah, which is you would say it's not in the home. It's right outside the home, right? You go out you go out your door and there it is. It's in your backyard. What about a lulav, an etrog, right? You can shake a lulav and etrog in your house. So it's not about being in the house or not. It's about the time boundness. At least that's the way the standard seems to speak. But it was too outrageous for the rabbis to imagine that Shabbat would be observed by half of the people and not by the other half of the people. So what the rabbis said was, we have 2 versions of the 10 commandments, right? One in Exodus and one in Deuteronomy. And there are various differences between the 2 of them. One is that in the first version, in Exodus, it says, Zachor et Yom HaShabbat L'Kadshon. Remember the Sabbath day to make it holy. In the Deuteronomy version, it says, Shamor et Yom HaShabbat L'Kadshon. Take care to make sure that Shabbat is holy. So the rabbis understood that Shamor is a language of restriction, of prohibition. Don't break Shabbat. Don't violate Shabbat. Zachor is a positive command. Make sure that you remember to keep Shabbat and do all of the things that make Shabbat holy, make Kiddush, and so on. So the rabbis then said, since they are both part of the 10 commandments, each version, one is in Exodus, one is in Deuteronomy, each version is synchronous with the other. We say in Lachadodi, Shamor v'Zachor b'dibur echad, that Shamor and Zachor, those 2 different words that are in the 2 versions, were actually said at the very same time. They were said together by God, that what we can't imagine happening, but in the text you can't have that as simultaneous, but it's actually as if they were put together. So therefore, say the rabbis, anyone involved in Shamor is also involved in Zachor. Anyone who has been addressed by Shamor, the negative, has also been addressed by Zachor. So Shabbat becomes an exception. Shabbat becomes this major exception to the rule of time-bound mitzvot, and that's why it's so possible for women to have that kind of women's commandment of lighting the Shabbat candles. Right? But for instance, how is it that the women light the Shabbat candles, but not the men? The answer is because the men go to pray. Prayer is a time-bound mitzvah. So women are not obligated to pray 3 times a day. There's a morning prayer that kicks in because it's morning. There's an afternoon prayer that kicks in because it's the afternoon. You can't pray the afternoon prayer at midnight. There's an evening prayer that kicks in when it's evening. You can't pray the evening prayer at 9 o'clock in the morning. So these are time-bound mitzvot. So that's why in the traditional communities, the men go off to shul Friday night and the women light the candles. So it's not that it's in the house that therefore they're obligated, but it's because they don't have to leave the house that they can actually do something. So so that's the way it usually works out. But of course, lighting the Friday night candles is a mitzvah on anybody. If you worked out a deal that no, you go to services and I'll stay home, says the man, then the man would light the Friday night candles and the woman would go pray.
Is there any,
yeah.
Rabbi, is there any place in this whole way of thinking where women actually pray?
Yes. So there is a theoretical general obligation on women to pray, but because of this rule that they're not bound by time-bound mitzvot, the point is that they are obligated to pray when they can pray.
Except that I thought the men had to pray with a minyan, and no woman would be considered a member of the minyan. So how does
Women
that
don't
work?
count in the minyan because women are not obligated to join that time-bound service. This is the traditional way of looking at things.
Right, yeah.
The traditional way of looking at things is yes, that's correct. The minyan is only people who are sharing the same obligation. It's a community of obligation joining together. So that's why women don't count, because they don't have that obligation. That's the traditional way of thinking about this. But women have the obligation to pray. So they have to pray whenever they can figure it out, right? They put their baby to take a nap, or after they finish washing the dishes at 3 o'clock in the morning, then they pray. Of course, the man doesn't wash the dishes, right? The woman has to wash the dishes. That's a time-bound mitzvah that they are obligated to do. So,
the men have a formulaic way of praying 3 times a day, correct?
Right. The men
What
have.
about the women?
So that's a good question. All of these are important questions. On the basic level, the first level of women obligation is that it seems that they're not obligated to particularly pray what the men are praying. There's a whole literature of what's called tchinas. Tchinas means prayer of supplication. These are women's prayers, sometimes written by men and sometimes written by women. Most of the time we have the bulk of the literature that we have is in Yiddish. Sometimes I've offered some of those prayers as readings on Rosh Hashanah back in the old days when we had, booklets of readings rather than having the Lev Shalem that we have now. They're very touching prayers, and they are prayers that are heartfelt offerings that speak out of the women's experience. There's a whole literature, for instance, about extra prayers that are recited by women when they light the Friday night candles. So they don't just light the Friday night candles, but they use that time as a time of prayer. And they pray for their family, and they pray for goodness, and they pray for their children, and they pray for all of Israel. It's all different kinds of elements that are in the prayers that have been contributed in a way that certainly touches on the basics of Jewish life, but doesn't follow the text of the official prayers that the men are obligated to recite. However, over the generations, there's been a back and forth on this. There's been a back and forth on women's participation, and there's throughout medieval times, there's a push and a pull about feeling that this is the right way to go, or feeling that there's by some women that there's an exclusion here and it's not fair. And what does it mean to celebrate a holiday without half my family being part of it, or without half of the Jewish people being part of it? So this is what we have, for instance, discussions, women who wanted to take a lulav and an etrog and have that mitzvah on Sukkot. It's a beautiful mitzvah. What's wrong with a woman doing that? So then you have all kinds of discussions. Can they do it? Can they not do it? When we say that women are exempt, does that mean that they're prohibited? How much are we protecting male prerogatives when we say that women are not obligated? Are we really trying to exclude them? Are we really trying to push them out the door? Or are we just leaving it as discretionary? So you have different voices. Some say, well, if a woman wants to do a holy act, so wonderful. Let them have a bracha for that. That's terrific that they're doing something terrific like that. And other people say, are you kidding? The whole point is they're not allowed to do it. Only those people who are commanded to do it. Yeah, Sarita.
So that there's there seems to be this whole, at least in the whole thing around that, if you do something that you're not obligated to do, it's kind of considered sort of being ostentatious, and that seems to apply a lot to women, but it also seems that there are times when that applies to men also, going beyond what you're
Right.
required to do, like there's something wrong with that.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's a whole tension in that, that whole back and forth. What does it mean to be more pious than you're obligated to be? Is that praiseworthy, right? To be extra pious. We just had in this past Shabbat's Torah reading about the Nazirite. The Nazirite voluntarily takes upon himself more obligations and more restrictions than necessary. There's no obligation to be a Nazirite. But if you are a Nazirite, then you have to follow certain rules. And one viewpoint in the rabbinic literature is at the end of the time, it's a temporary status that the Nazirite has. When he finishes being a Nazirite, he or she, they have to bring a sin offering. So the rabbi said, what did they bring a sin offering for? He just led this exemplary life. He just took on even more holiness than usual. And the answer is, that's the sin. The sin is, God didn't ask you to do this. God wants you to enjoy life to the fullest. So why are you restricting your enjoyment of life even more than you have to? Right? Take God's guidelines and live them to the fullest, and don't make more guidelines than you have to. Who are you? So that kind of like presumptuousness, as you mentioned, is sometimes seen as a danger. So there's a back and forth of real respect for people who are more holy, quote unquote, than the average person, and then a kind of suspicion, who do they think they are, and what's the ego trip that's going on with this? Now add that, which applies to men, and add that to a general suspicion of women in a patriarchal society, and then you just double it down even more. Who do these women think they are? I mean, I remember when I used to participate in conversations with a lot of Orthodox rabbis and educators, and of course this is again part of our modern situation, where even in the Orthodox world, there are many more women who want to participate and who want to be involved in things that they weren't involved in before. Studying Torah, women were not involved in studying Torah. Prayer groups, women's prayer groups, they were not involved in those kinds of things. So there was a lot of suspicion on the part of the rabbis and the leaders of the community. And there was always this undercurrent of, they're not doing it for the sake of heaven. They're being selfish. They're really just because they want to be like men. They're on a power trip. They want to, it's this kind of really obnoxious, strutting of complete, unself-conscious power assertion. As if all the men are completely authentically, driven by wanting to serve God and have no egos whatsoever, and it's only those women when they want to pray. Oh, it must be an ego trip. It was pretty ugly, actually, and this is a struggle. This is a struggle that we have in our community. So, and I mean by our community, like the human community, because look at what's going on with, for instance, in our presidential race. Who survived the primary shaking out of candidates. It's pretty obvious to many people that all the women got rejected because at least part of it was because they were women, and now there's this pushback. No, so now Biden has to have a woman as his running mate to make up for the fact that we threw out all the women when they were running to be the number one. So we still have a lot of ambivalence about this. We still have a lot of work to do, and to harp on something that I've the dead horse that I keep beating. When I started in Shomrei, and I said, how about all the women be obligated just like the men to put on a talit at services? And nobody wanted to do that. It was considered a breach of my what can I say? That it was a chutzpah on my part to push people around and say that all women should put on a talit. We make a rule. We don't care what you do in your personal life. You walk into Shomrei, God willing, we should be able to all walk into Shomrei soon, safely. You walk into Shomrei, you join a service. If you're a man, you put on a talit. Why don't we make that rule for women? If we believe in egalitarianism, then why don't we do that? And the pushback was serious. So we still have a lot of problems about this. We still have, and resentments. If I were a woman, maybe it would have gone down better. But it came off a little bit as, oh, here's this man now telling the women what to do. So it's complicated. So back to here. Here we have a statement that the women are obligated in the reading of the Megillah. Nashim chayavot b'mikra Megillah. So why? Certainly Megillah is a time-bound mitzvah. It's only on either the 14th or the 15th. It comes, once a year, Purim. So how is it that they're obligated? So here we have the phrase, for they too were involved in that miracle. She'af hein, for they as well, or even they, hayu were ba'oto hanes, in that specific miracle. So how do we understand that phrase? Okay, let's look at note 8.
Okay, let me find it.
It's in the bottom of the left-hand column of the notes.
Okay. Haman's decree to kill the Jews included women, as the verse states, to destroy, to slay, and to exterminate all Jews, young and old, children and women. Thus, they too were saved by the miracle of Purim.
Okay, so let's stop here for a second. And this is a statement, and even the verse is an interesting verse, right? Haman decided to destroy all the Jews. If we would have stopped there, period. That's all the Jews, right? And yet, the verse has to continue and specify young and old, right? Children and women. As if all the Jews, that includes all the men, that's for sure. But does it also include the little children? Does it include the young ones that aren't yet responsible, that don't know what they're doing? Does it include the women? So the verse has to tell us that it includes the women. So this is a reflection again of that kind of like overall bias of who's being talked to and who's not being talked to. I wrote a little bit about that in Torah Sparks this past week with regard to the marginal in general. So they were under the same decree. They were under the same danger of extermination, of death. So therefore, that they were saved. They also have to be grateful, and they also have to proclaim the miracle. Remember, reading the Megillah is seen by the rabbis as this expression of gratitude and praise to God for the miracle. Pirsume nisa, publicizing the miracle. So when a person is put under extreme danger, they are obligated to thank God. So the fact that this obligation comes about once a year is not relevant here, says Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, because the obligation is personal. The obligation is really about the fact that God saved your life. That's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is that this is a celebration of the people of Israel, not as a religious group, but as an ethnic nation. And the women are just as much part of the nation as the men. So, it's what we say sometimes, sadly, Hitler didn't discriminate between the good Jews and the bad Jews, between the Jews that believed or didn't believe. He wanted to destroy all of them. Same thing with Haman. Haman didn't care that the women were less, quote unquote, Jewishly involved than the men. He wanted to destroy Jews. So therefore, the fact is that women, even though they're not full religious participants in Jewish religious practice, they are full participants in the national life of the Jewish people. So therefore, this celebration applies to them as well. Okay? But now we have another way of understanding it. Alternatively, back in the note.
Okay. Alternatively, the Gemara means that the miracle was performed through them, for it was through Esther that the miracle of Purim occurred. Even though women are generally exempt from all
Positive, time-bound.
Time-bound mitzvot, both biblical and rabbinical, see Tosafos to Pesachim, they are nevertheless obligated in the Megillah reading for the reason given above.
Okay, so now we have a different interpretation, that they were involved in the miracle, right? When it says in the miracle, it doesn't say they were involved in the danger, right? The first interpretation that we read was, of course, they were involved in Haman's plan to be destroyed. So then they were saved. But now this reading says, no, let's read it a little bit more carefully. They were involved in the miracle means they made the miracle happen. It was they. The word here is not even they, but rather specifically they. The word af could be read in that way. It is through them that the miracle happened. So we have a whole discussion about this in you have all these citations, all these other commentaries and so on. Another example where this comes up is Hanukkah. Right? In Hanukkah, the women are commanded to light the Hanukkah candles just as much as the men. We're all commanded to light Hanukkah candles. Why? Hanukkah, again, is literally a time-bound mitzvah. It's about celebrating a mitzvah a miracle that happened at a particular time. You can't light Hanukkah candles in March. You have to light Hanukkah candles on Hanukkah. It's time-bound. So how come women are obligated? So the Talmud says they're obligated because they also were in that miracle, or even they were in that miracle, or specifically they were in that miracle. So therefore, some people say that Hanukkah also, we're giving credit to Judah Maccabee and so on. We should give credit also to Hannah and her 7 children, who are the first examples in Jewish history of martyrs, of people who are willing to die for the sake of the Torah, for the sake of being Jewish. So they brought the miracle about. If not for them, there wouldn't have been a miracle. Another example. So those are 2 rabbinic rules, Hanukkah and Purim. Let's take matzah. Let's take the obligation to eat matzah on Pesach. Guess what? It's a time-bound mitzvah. You don't fulfill the mitzvah of matzah by eating matzah now, even though I still eat matzah now. But it's no longer matzah, right? So matzah is only on Pesach. And women are obligated to eat matzah on the first night of Pesach at the Seder. Why are they obligated? So the Talmud asks that question, and the Talmud answers, the same phrase. So then the question is, what does that mean? So one answer is, look, the slavery in Egypt, again, applying the 2 alternative explanations that we have here for Megillah. The slavery in Egypt was suffering for everybody. All of them were involved in that suffering. When we got out of Egypt, we all got out of Egypt. So the women also were part of experiencing that miracle. So, of course, they should be obligated. That's one way to read it. But the other way to read it is, if not for the women, we never would have gotten out of Egypt. Right? And this is something that we talk about at our Seder every year, and it's really crucial to understand. The very beginning parts of the Exodus story are all about heroic women. The midwives, Miriam, Yocheved, her mother, and even the daughter of Pharaoh, right? So all of these women are crucial players in making it possible for us to get out of Egypt. So some, commentators say that's the point. The obligation comes out of the active role that the women played in making the miracle come about. Now, on the one hand, there's something really great about that, because it finally gives some credit to the active role of the women. On the other hand, you could see a downside to it also, in that if that's how you understand the phrase, what you're really saying is, it's not because women are Jews just like men are Jews. We're all included in the same destiny. We're all included in the same risks. We're all included in the same miracles. That's the first explanation. So let's recognize it, that when we have certain fundamental experiences as Jews, it applies to everybody. That's the first argument. Second argument is, we're not going to let women be included unless they earn it, right? Unless they do something special. You know, it's like what we have in general, you know, for marginalized people, you know, we'll include you if you're twice as good as we are. If you really, you know, can show that you really deserve it, then we'll give you a job, we'll give you a place, an admission in school, whatever. You have to be twice as good as the privileged person. So that could be one way of cynically reading that recognition. Oh, you know why the women are obligated here? Because they really went above and beyond. So, okay, we'll let them in this time. But when women are just plain Jews like everybody else, the men don't have to have created the miracle in order to be obligated. The men just have to be Jews. That's not the case for the women in that second interpretation. So that second interpretation has a kind of like a double-edged quality to it. Okay, so now let's get back to the rest of this note, because the rest of this note takes us to another part of the vagueness of this teaching.
The authorities dispute whether or not a woman can read the Megillah on behalf of a man. Some hold that a woman's obligation only to hear the Megillah, not to read it. And therefore, a woman cannot exempt a man whose obligation is to read the Megillah and normally fulfills his obligation through the principle of
Shomrei ke'oneh. To hear it is the same thing as say it. Okay, so that, and the rest of it is citations.
Right.
So here we get an interesting example of something that sounds in the Talmud as a pretty straightforward teaching, right? Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says women are obligated in the reading of the Megillah. And yet there's a pushback, right? That inclusion of women to be fully participatory in Megillah reading is found in various sources to be not accepted. So Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi's teaching is either not accepted, that other people disagree with him, or they want to reread what he said so that it's acceptable. So for instance, in the Tosefta is a series of baraitot. Baraitot means external teachings that didn't make it into the Mishnah, but they're from the time of the Mishnah. You have in the Tosefta the explicit statement that women are not obligated in reading Megillah. So the simplest way of looking at this is that Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi disagrees. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says, no, don't give me this business about the time-bound mitzvot. Women are obligated in Megillah because they were involved also, in whichever way we understand that involvement. So Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi is taking a stand vis-a-vis the other tradition, the other voice, which wants to exclude women. And Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says, no, we have to include them. But then there's always a tendency that we have in our tradition. Let's not make a big fight if we can avoid it. Let's see if we can get some middle ground where everybody can agree, right? In which case we can say, well, what the Tosefta is saying is not that women are completely not obligated. They're not obligated in reading Megillah. They're obligated to hear the Megillah being read for them. So they need to be included in the community to hear the Megillah read for them, but a man has to read it for them, right? Re-establishing that kind of hierarchy of who's the boss, who's the one who can actually do this. And when Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi says that women are obligated, he's not arguing with the Tosefta. He's simply saying, don't forget, even though they can't read Megillah, they're obligated in listening to the Megillah. So, of course, the awkwardness of the phrase in the Talmud, Mikra Megillah, means the reading of the Megillah. But that's not such a big problem, because when we talk about reading the Megillah, most of us are not reading the Megillah. We're just listening to the Megillah. So they're obligated to hear the reading of the Megillah. That would be the way to harmonize those two statements. But it's not just a question of texts. It's a question of attitude. What do we actually feel comfortable with? Do we feel comfortable in giving women full agency when it comes to this mitzvah? Or does it still give us the creeps? Does it still make us feel very, very uncomfortable? So that's the split. That's the split in these two camps. One camp is saying, okay, when it comes to Megillah, all the way. And that means that each of us is equally obligated for the other. And that means that each of us can help the other discharge their obligation. One of the things that we've been talking about throughout this whole start from the beginning of the tractate is when we talk about reading the Megillah, as I just said, not everybody is reading the Megillah. One person reads the Megillah and everybody else listens. What's that all about? The answer is that's because we are there for each other. We are a community of shared responsibility. So therefore, one of us who is obligated can help out all the other people who are obligated as long as everybody else is paying attention. If everybody's paying attention to my reading, then my reading counts for everybody. Yeah.
Rabbi, it's sort of an interesting study of women's rights. I can see
Right.
that.
Absolutely.
But I'm also wondering about women's education. In today's very Orthodox world, we see the young men being educated, not really the women as much. When you say this, well, maybe the women couldn't read.
So that's an important point. And in fact, the Talmud relates to that in a number of places where they say, they have a whole discussion. Can a woman say the benching, the grace after meals, the Birkat HaMazon, for her husband? So there's a whole discussion. And one of the things that's said is, well, yeah, that's okay. If they're both equally obligated, then they can both help each other. And the woman can certainly say the Birkat HaMazon for her husband. And then the Gemara says what you were saying. But what a shame it is that she's the educated one and he's not. That she knows how to bench and he doesn't know how to bench. What a shanda. What a humiliation. So the idea that the woman should be educated and the man not was considered scandalous. And you're right.
Yeah.
In general, the women were not educated to the same degree as the men. So, but there were women who were educated. There were women who ended up actually being quite learned, not just competent, but actually learned. And we have stories in the Talmud about that. And sometimes it makes people uncomfortable. So, but that's over 1,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago. The truth of the matter is what you were saying about the Orthodox world is not quite true. The Orthodox world has undergone a revolution over the last 100 years. And it's a revolution that is slowly changing the entire fabric of Orthodox society, not just the modern Orthodox world, but even the ultra Orthodox world. The modern Orthodox world is much more open to women's education. And there was a big fight 100 years ago in Europe about whether women should start being educated in the basics of Judaism. They weren't until then in a systematic way. It was all an individual thing, whether somebody's family wanted the women to know something or not. And as the 20th century came in, what we started seeing was the men were getting this traditional education. And the traditional education was very rich in terms of Torah study, but it was completely impoverished when it came to actual, modern thinking and modern information. So you had these very learned young men who knew nothing about the basics of living in the real world, And that is echoed today in Israel, for instance, in the ultra-Orthodox community. But the women, since they weren't obligated to study Torah, they had tutors who taught them languages, who taught them, no. Purity is not, laws of purity are not time-bound because they can happen anytime. Even though, Stuart asked a question. So that's a whatchamacallit, what can I say? A tangent. Let's go off just to answer that for real quick. Women are obligated in laws of purity. First of all, most of the laws of purity are prohibitions, right? So you have to make sure that you clear away the prohibitions. So a menstruating woman is not allowed to sleep with her husband, and her husband is not allowed to sleep with her, as long as she is ritually impure by virtue of the menstruation. So the idea of going to the mikveh is eliminating that prohibition, number one. Number two, impurity doesn't happen at any specific time. You can have an irregular period. You can become ritually impure by touching a dead animal anytime. So it's not specifically tied to the communal calendar, right? It's tied to your own personal situation. Back to this. So when it comes to Torah study for women, what happened was that people started seeing that the women, since they were exempt from Torah study, they were getting a much more sophisticated education. And they were learning, they were reading novels, and they were learning all kinds of languages, and they were actually not literate in Jewish living. And the amount of assimilation that was happening among the women was shocking to a lot of leaders, and it was breaking up Jewish families. So a woman, shocking again, a woman came up with the idea that maybe actually women should be taught something about Judaism. Her name was Sarah Schneerer, and she started Beit Yaakov, the Beth Jacob schools. And in the beginning, there was tremendous denunciation. What does she think she's doing? This is not allowed. You're not allowed to teach women. And again, that whole extreme, once women are not obligated, then don't let them. And finally, in the 20s, in the 1920s, she won the battle by getting some great rabbis to reluctantly acknowledge, if we don't do some kind of minimal Jewish education for the women, the Jewish people will be destroyed from the inside. So they acknowledged that they had to be taught, but they tried to make very serious limitations. You can't teach them Talmud. You can only teach them what they need to know, etc., etc., etc. But once the door was opened a little bit, it gradually got open more and more and more and more and more, so that today there's a very, very strong reality of Orthodox women studying Talmud and attaining levels of learning that are completely equal with the best in the men's yeshivas. But it's still controversial. Can a woman who's Orthodox be a rabbi? There's a little joke that I sometimes think about. There was a rabbi who was a very prominent rabbi in the conservative movement, and he was very, very learned, and he was considered one of the serious young generation of scholars. And in the 80s, he left the conservative movement when the conservative movement decided to ordain women. He said, that's too much. You can't do that. It was, he was a product of the seminary, and he was again, very well regarded in the conservative movement, and he left because that was, a step too far. And that was like completely abandoning tradition. About 5 years ago, his daughter decided to become ordained as a rabbi in a modern Orthodox yeshiva. And he is now teaching in that yeshiva. He's teaching women to become rabbis. So he never rejoined the conservative movement, and he never acknowledged that maybe they weren't so wrong as he thought. But now that it was his own daughter, so all of a sudden he decided that, it is acceptable, which is the way we see stories, happening all the time. It happens a lot, for instance, with gay children, that, parents that were, totally unalterably opposed to accepting this terrible thing, and then all of a sudden they realize because their own child is gay. Hey, guess what? Gays really are nice people, and they really are fully human, and they deserve love and support. So we learn our lessons in various kinds of ways. So in the Orthodox world, women are more and more and more and more involved in Torah study, and it's again a big struggle to justify it. How do you theoretically go get your mind around? How do you get around the traditional texts that say that women shouldn't be studying Torah? So Josie just reminded us that we have a history in Shomrei about this, right? That it's complicated. There's no one reason that things happen, but one of the reasons that BK was founded was over arguments over the women's role in the congregation.
So that isn't what, Rabbi, that isn't what drove it, I don't think.
Okay, so I'm saying there's more than one reason, but it was definitely one of the reasons. Yeah, Geraldine.
One of the reasons that we started counting the women in the Nutley congregation, even with our Orthodox rabbi, was that our group was so small that if we didn't count the women, we wouldn't ever be able to have a service on Shabbos. And it preserved the community. And that was the rabbi's feeling. Right. And that's why he permitted that.
So this is a really really important kind of problem to think about. I think about it all the time. When there's a phrase in the Talmud, Yikov hadin et tahar, Yikov aharat hadin. When does reality push the law to change? And when is a principle in the law sacred and has to be maintained despite what's happening in the social situation that you're in? And there's no perfect balancing act or solution to have that. But saying, well, if we don't do it, then we're not going to be able to to do the things that we want. Is that a sufficient reason? Is that a compelling reason to overturn something that has been a tradition for a long time? When does that tradition simply reflect some kind of reality that's changed? And when does that tradition teach us some kind of countercultural principle that we need to stand up for? I'm just bringing that up as a kind of a theoretical conundrum that we all are subject to trying to figure out. Okay, so we're going to stop here, and God willing, we'll continue next week. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you.
Happy Mother's Day to everyone. Yes.
Thank you. Thanks, Rabbi. Always a good session.